In the first unit, we talked about conflicting loyalties. Canadians can see this firsthand when we consider the conflict over land with the Canadian government and Aboriginal peoples. Quick note, it has now been constitutionally established that Aboriginal peoples includes the hundreds of nations that are First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, so that's the term I'll be using. Connection to the land is a big part of national identity for many Aboriginal groups. An example of how land created a conflicting loyalty is our Inuit people, who were moved by the federal government into a more central location in order to better provide support for the people. They also moved the people to areas to help with our land claims in the north. If Canadians are living on it, we can claim the land. But that meant that the Inuit lost their relationship with their traditional lands and in turn became even more dependent on the government. This would severely impact the collective and individual identity, as most people would prefer to not depend on an outside source. Today, the Inuit are reclaiming their national identity, and the Government of Canada is seeking to reconcile what they've done. For example, the creation of the territory of Nunavut was a big step towards Inuit self-determination. The Inuit people in the region wanted the opportunity and the challenges that come with governing yourself, much like how you want the freedom to make your own decisions, to embrace the opportunities and challenges that come with adulthood. The government of Nunavut is different from any other government in Canada. It's based on consensus instead of conflict, and the government funding is helping the Inuit people to celebrate their cultural heritage. Obviously, control over land is a key aspect of self-determination, and land claims across Canada are a contentious issue. The United Nations has declared that Indigenous groups should have the right to national self-determination. This is because the control over local resources and the ability to make decisions for your own people, such as the education of your children, can help a nation achieve their national goals. But many fear for the unity of Canada if we allow greater sovereignty for our Aboriginal groups. Now, just so you know, I am not aware of any consideration for full sovereignty for any Aboriginal groups. Instead, it's a move towards a sort of sovereignty association. In other words, the sovereign regions would have power similar to our municipal governments, just like how the government of Airdrie has control over certain aspects of our lives, but still must report to the provincial and federal authorities on other issues. Many Aboriginal groups are very frustrated at the slow pace of land claims. For example, the conflict over the land in the James Bay region started in 1971, and while some agreements were made, conflict still arose until the early 2000s. And a land claims issue for the Lubicon in northern Alberta has lasted since 1975, with the Alberta government allowing oil and gas companies to explore and build pipelines on the land, with some oil spills destroying habitats and threatening both human and animal health. And what's really frustrating is that what's holding everything up here is essentially a clerical glitch. The Lubicon did not sign the treaty because they were missed when the treaty commissioner was going around getting bands to sign it in 1899. So they're not protected by any treaty rights. And yet, a treaty for Northern Alberta was signed, so legally the land is under the control of the government. The United Nations has formally reprimanded the Canadian government for these actions. The Niska case in BC was a historical event in the settlement of land claims. The Niska had never signed a treaty, yet the government still took their land. In the 1970s, the Niska launched a land claims case of their own. Remember, before 1951, it was illegal for them to even raise funds to fight land claims. In 1973, the courts ruled that the Niska had a case, but the Niska settlement wasn't formalized until 1998. With 2,000 square kilometers of land and millions of dollars given to assist the band in setting up self-government. In addition, all historical relics held by the governments in museums was to be returned to the people. Many non-native people in this area felt that the Niska band was given way too much, while many native groups felt that the government hadn't done nearly enough to compensate the Niska for the seizure of their lands without the signing of a treaty. And the Métis people of Canada have also fought for a degree of self-determination. But remember, they're not covered by treaties because they're not First Nations. However, in Alberta, Métis settlements were created in 1938 to provide a geographical area for nations to settle, and in 1990, the government expanded the rights of the Métis to have a degree of self-government and ownership over the land. This is unique to our province. One of the most famous land claims conflicts was the Oka crisis in 1990. What made this conflict even more ironic, or, well, really sad, was that it was over the expansion of a golf course, and the land in question was traditional land that included an ancestral burial ground. In 1977, the Kanesatake Nation brought a case stating that their lands had been taken from them, but the courts disagreed. So when the Oka government approved the building expansion, the Kanesatake Mohawks began to protest, building barricades. When the police were brought in to break up the protest, shots were fired and a police officer was killed. Canadians had seen Aboriginal protests before, but none had become violent in our recent memory, so the killing of a police officer over a land claim was very distressing. As a response to this and the continuing blockades of major roadways, the government sent in the military, and this led to a month-long standoff. In the meantime, there were international reporters arriving in the area and reporting that the Canadian government is militarily threatening a First Nations group over the building of a golf course. Yeah, that really helped our reputation as being a peaceful and multicultural nation state. In the end, the golf course is not built, and the federal government purchases the land to prevent future development, but that land isn't transferred to the Mohawk people. After this terrible event, the Government of Canada creates a Royal Commission to look at the lives of Aboriginal peoples in Canada. A Royal Commission is a thorough research study. The panel leading the commission interviewed hundreds of people in order to get as many perspectives as possible on the historical, cultural, economic, and political conditions for Aboriginal peoples in Canada. The 5-volume report stated that the relationship between Aboriginal peoples and the government needed to change significantly. While the ideas of paternalism had formally been removed from most legislation, many paternalistic attitudes continue to exist. The report stated that there must be mutual recognition and respect, and a shared responsibility for supporting each other. Essentially, this goes back to the ideas that were proposed in the Wampum Belt of 1613 or the Royal Proclamation of 1763, both of which stated that First Nations had the inherent right to self-determination. In 1998, the Government of Canada sought to reconcile the problems that had been created by the past through issuing a formal apology and accepting wrongdoing. This was followed up with the 2008 formal apology and financial restitution to the students who had attended residential schools. One of the report's strongest recommendations was for the federal government to do more to provide self-determination for Aboriginal groups across Canada in order for those nations to pursue their own national interests. This would include both the settlement of land claims and the establishment of self-government in those geographical areas. By allowing these nations to have their own education, police force, and control over resources, they could better respond to the needs of their people. And First Nations groups do recognize there are many issues that exist on their reserves. When looking at the statistical data, the living conditions of our First Nations people is appalling. Less than 43% of FNMI students graduate high school. There can be up to 80% unemployment for people living on a reserve. In Saskatchewan, 72% of inmates are Aboriginal, even though they only make up 15% of the population. The infant mortality rate, which we use to determine access to health care, can be up to 4 times higher, and 54% of reserve housing is considered to be substandard. For example, 23% of reserve housing doesn't have piped clean water or sewage. On average, a First Nations person earns 30% less than an average Canadian, and youth suicide rates are 6 times higher on a reserve. So while Canada often ranks in the top 10 of the UN Human Development Index, if just our reserve populations were considered, they'd be ranked 63rd. Think about that. That means you could name 62 other countries in the world that have better living conditions. Of course, there's many reasons for these conditions. A dependency on government handouts, which can in turn affect self-esteem, or the continuing legacy of residential schools, which created a lack of support for education in some communities. The use of drugs and alcohol as a coping mechanism to deal with the effects of the long-term abuse experienced in those schools, and a lack of parenting skills as previous generations were raised away from their families. Now, none of these should be used as an excuse to not try and make things better, but those who are living outside of these conditions need to try and have some understanding and empathy instead of merely judging others. And sometimes it can be hard because Aboriginal cultures have different values from the non-native community. There's a greater emphasis on putting family first, protection of the environment over economic development, and a focus on the now, which can sometimes be seen as a disregard for time or appointments in the future. And that can create conflicts with non-native Canadians who may not understand those cultural differences. The thing to remember about the events I've talked about in this video is that there's just so many perspectives. There's going to be people watching this video that are going to say, I've taken sides. Either I didn't do enough to explain the frustrations of Aboriginal groups, or I've made the rest of Canada just seem like they're heartless people who don't care. But that's the thing about living in a democracy. We're all allowed to have our own opinions. But let's try and find out as much information as we can, and then talk to people who disagree with us so we can have a better understanding about this great country we live in. In the end, what we must really consider is how these events impact the national interests and perspectives of Aboriginal peoples, as well as Canada as a whole.